Okay, thank you all for joining another Search Discovery Education Community session. Today, this session is going to be in the Adobe Analytics area, and we're going to talk about Vista and data sources. So before we dive into the content, just a little bit of housekeeping information. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Adam Greco. I've spent a long time in the Adobe Analytics world, been part of lots of Adobe Analytics implementations and helped Adobe write the book on the product on Adobe Analytics. And I'm excited to be here. So the SDEC, if you're new to the SDEC, this is a free community that we've created to provide some education around areas in digital analytics. We've got 12 topic areas, and when you signed up for the group, you probably chose one or two, or however many you wanted. You can always change which topics you want by just emailing me at sdec@searchdiscovery.com if you want to add some more, or if you're sick of getting too many meeting invites, you can trim down the topics. Maybe your eyes were bigger than your stomach when you first joined. So if you know of other folks who want to join or be part of this community, you can always just have them email me at sdec@searchdiscovery as well. One thing I wanted to bring to everyone's attention is, for some reason that I can't fathom, we only have about 2/3 of the SDEC members that have joined the Slack group. The Slack group is where you can see all of the recordings of all of the past webinars. It also gives you a way to quickly send DM messages to anyone else. We have over 3,000 members in the SDEC. So if there's someone you wanted to talk to in the analytics community, you're one click away. And we even have a job postings group if you want to hire people or look for a new job. So if you're on this call and you're either not in the SDEC already or you're not in the Slack group, just email me at sdec@searchdiscovery.com. It takes about 2 seconds to join the Slack group and I can get you in. For today's webinar, if you have questions, please post them in the Zoom Q&A area, not the chat. Today, I am both moderator and presenter, so that makes it a little more challenging. This will be recorded, so if there's anything you missed, you'll be able to check it out in the Slack group, and I'll get to as many questions as I can at the end in Q&A. And again, if you need the recording, you can always email me at sdec@searchdiscovery.com. So let's talk about Adobe Analytics and Vista and data sources. I find that this is an area of Adobe Analytics that some people don't really delve into because it's a little bit more esoteric and it's a little bit more complex and a little more advanced. So unless you've been using Adobe Analytics for 10 years, you may not even know what Vista and data sources is. So let's kind of go through it at a high level overview today. So what is Vista and data sources? Before I get into the actual details, the thing that they have in common, and the reason why I group these together, is because they're basically an alternative way to get data into Adobe Analytics. And you can either use Vista and data sources to manipulate data or actually inject new data into Adobe Analytics. And it's basically an alternative to JavaScript tagging, or for cases when things happen that you can't control in JavaScript, or things that maybe happen after the website. Now, there is a particular thing called processing rules, which is kind of related to Vista, and I debated about putting it in here, but I was afraid I was going to not have enough time to get through everything. But processing rules are things that can be configured directly in the interface, and maybe at some point we'll have a whole topic just talking about processing rules and maybe combine that with marketing channels. But for now, we're going to just focus on Vista and data sources. And Vista and data sources are also different than Saint classifications, which is also a way to inject data. But in that case, you're really just injecting metadata. So that's why I kind of group these two together. But let's dig in and let's start with Vista. So Vista is something that's actually been around, believe it or not, for almost 20 years. Back in 2003 is when I first started using VISTA rules. And VISTA stands for Visitor Identification, Segmentation, Transformation, Architecture. Back in the early days of Omniture, they were really into snazzy acronyms. So what is VISTA? So VISTA is a server-side method of manipulating and or inserting data into Adobe Analytics. Now, there's certain things that you can do with VISTA. Nowadays, with tag management systems, some of these things have also been replaced by what you could do just in like Adobe Launch. But for example, in the old days, we might use VISTA to take data that is going into one report suite and make a decision based on the data that's being collected. Should that go to more than one report suite? Should we route it to other report suites? We might also, in the old world, copy data into additional variables. So for example, as many of you may know, if you have something like an out-of-the-box report, like browser or screen height, you can't actually use same classifications on an out-of-the-box report. So there's been cases where some people have said, you know what, I'm going to use a VISTA rule to copy some of the out-of-the-box data and just stick it into an EVAR or an SPROP, so then later I can use same classifications. But again, nowadays, some of that stuff can be done just through dynamic tagging, and some of it can be done through things just like in Adobe Launch. Another example of where you might use a VISTA rule is you might split out concatenated values. Maybe your developers are kind of concatenating a bunch of values into a particular string, but you want to actually split it out and put different parts of different variables into different EVARs and different SPROPs. Or conversely, you might actually have a bunch of data that's coming in from your data layer, and you might decide, you know what, I actually want to concatenate that together into one EVAR because maybe I'm running out of EVARs, and then I'll use maybe a rule builder classification to later split that out. And then in the old days, we might use VISTA rules to look at maybe IP addresses and either, discard the data, or maybe if it's a IP range that has to do with our employees, maybe we might use a VISTA rule to move employee traffic to a different report suite. So in many cases, we're basically using VISTA to kind of look at the data that's coming in, server side, make a decision what we want to do with that, and either modify it, move it, copy it, and so on. Now, in terms of the way that Adobe processes information, I'm sure this has been updated. This is an old diagram that I found. I don't know exactly how old this is, but as you know, there's kind of an order of operations in which data is processed that goes through Adobe Analytics, starting with tags coming in, then the processing rules, and so on. VISTA rules are pretty early in that process, and basically they do a lot of the work in the pre-processing area, which means that all of the stuff that happens post-processing, like attribution and all the stuff you love in terms of saying classifications and participation and using attribution IQ, all of that stuff is applicable to stuff that has been manipulated with VISTA, because VISTA basically happens pretty early on. And in many cases, the back end of Adobe Analytics doesn't really even know if a VISTA rule has run on the data that is ultimately ending up in EVARs, SPROPs, and events. And in many respects, the way that I kind of think of VISTA is think of it like an Excel macro for Adobe Analytics. Now, unfortunately, you can't create a VISTA rule yourself. And that's why Adobe created processing rules, because it was basically a way to offload some of the work that was being done in the old days with tons of VISTA rules, so that they could basically use the 80-20 rule and get a lot of the VISTA rules away from the engineering group. But they're currently still done by Adobe. I believe it's still done by the engineering services group. They do cost additional money. Generally, I think the price range is somewhere around $3,000 to $5,000. I don't know. I'm sure there's inflation, but you could ask your client care representative how much it costs to build a VISTA rule. And one thing that it used to be the case, and I believe is still the case, is that even if you pay to build a Vista rule, if you need to make changes to that Vista rule, there is sometimes an additional charge to go in and crack open the code and make changes to it. So Vista is something that you really want to use kind of as like a last resort if you can't do it any other way, because it's one of the few things in Adobe Analytics that's kind of has a per use upcharge. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Vista. I don't actually use Vista very often, but there is a different flavor of Vista that I do use on occasion that's called DB Vista. And this is another area where I find a lot of people don't really understand or aren't familiar with it. So DB Vista is basically a Vista rule that has a database behind it, and it has data that you can upload via FTP, and then it will look up to that data as the Vista rule is processing. This is really, really powerful, especially in cases where you have data that you don't know in real time. You don't know at the time the JavaScript tag is firing, and you don't want to have to like hold up your user to go hit a database and get something. Because as we all know, page load speed has dramatic impacts on conversion. So what are some examples of when you would use DB Vista? Well, one might be to look up product costs and insert them into a currency success event. So someone comes to your website, they order product A, and they're paying $100 for it. Well, if you have the latest and greatest cost of product A in the data table, in the DB Vista table, and let's say the cost is $70, then you could actually insert that server side in real time into a currency success event. So now you've got your revenue, and then you've got your product cost. And then obviously you can use a calculated metric to subtract the two. And what's really cool about that is all of your EVARs and everything else will be tied not only to the revenue, but also to the cost. Another example might be looking up customer lifetime value and sticking that into an EVAR. Maybe saying, you know what, I'm going to hit my database, my DB Vista table, and maybe that DB Vista table is updated every 4 hours or every 24 hours. And we see that customer 111 is on our website and just logged in. And what we want to do is do a lookup on customer 111, see that their lifetime value is $1,200, stick that into an EVAR. And now we know at that point in time what their customer lifetime value was. We similarly can look up the number of orders they've ever had at our company. Maybe we again hit the DB Vista table and populate the number of orders into an EVAR. Or we might want to look up employee information. Maybe if it's an intranet site, you can, look at their employee ID and look maybe how long they've been at the company. If you maybe want to see how are people using the homepage of the intranet. So anytime where you have data that you'd want to look up, that's where DB Vista can be pretty powerful. And even though you have to pay for the Vista rule once, you don't have to pay Adobe every time you need to upload data to it. You can just do new data, change or remove data all through FTP. And there's a whole user guide that Adobe provides on how to keep your DB Vista table updated. And many of my clients in the past have done that in an automated way, so they don't even have to think about it. Their backend data is just always updated in the DB Vista table. Now, in the past, when I've talked about Saint classifications, I used this example where I said, we have a customer that has an EVAR with customer ID, and they made a Saint classification, which was the CRM segment that customer went into. And when I spoke about Saint classifications, I talked about how this was the absolute wrong thing to do, because that CRM segment for each customer is changing week or month after month. So having it as a Saint classification is really bad, because as we learned, Saint classifications are retroactive. But this would be a good example of where you would want to use DB Vista instead of Saint. And I bring up this example because in many cases, while this is not the intention of DB Vista, one weird way that I like to think of DB Vista is I kind of think of it as almost like a real-time, non-retroactive version of Saint classifications. Because instead of you keeping a Saint table updated, you're actually keeping a database table updated. But If you want to avoid the retroactive nature of Saint, but you don't have the data in real time at the time of tagging, which is also common with Saint, you have to really think about, should I be using Saint or DB Vista? And if we use this kind of CRM example, I think this will really help bring it home for you. So earlier I talked about how you wouldn't want to have CRM segment as a Saint classification because it keeps changing. But let's use a DB Vista example. So customer hits your website and logs in. So we have the customer ID and an EVAR. Then we basically have a table that takes the customer ID and every 24 hours updates for every customer ID what customer CRM segment they're in. But since we don't want to do that via Saint, we do that in the DB Vista table. And now every time they come to the website, the DB Vista rule kicks in, looks at the customer ID, grabs the CRM segment, and sticks it in an EVAR. And what's powerful about that is you're getting the segment, the CRM segment at the time of the visit. And this is really crucial. If customer A was in CRM segment, just say they're the baby boomer segment, whatever. If tomorrow, for some reason, that customer moved into a different segment like high spenders, and that person had come today, they would be in the baby boomer segment. But then tomorrow, as long as the DB Vista table has been updated correctly, they would be actually assigned in the EVAR into the high spender segment, which now means that when you're doing segmentation, everything works and you're not incorrectly assuming that, as you would with Saint, that the person has always been in the high spender segment. So that's just one of many examples of how you can use DB Vista. And if you have questions, I'm more than happy to kind of answer those. So now let's switch gears and let's move into data sources. So data sources is basically a manual method of importing data into Adobe Analytics. And primarily what you're importing are metrics. Data sources is really set up for importing metrics. And in general, most people use data sources to import metrics that don't happen on the website, but metrics that they want to merge or see with on-site metrics. So some examples of when you would use data sources is maybe you want to import advertising metrics, like on your website, you know how many visits you have from each campaign, but you may not know maybe the number of impressions that took place out on Google, or how often it was displayed if it's a display ad. And maybe you can grab that from Google or DoubleClick and you can import that in. And in fact, in many cases, Adobe themselves uses data sources with some of their products like advertising analytics and so on, where they actually pre-do that for you. Another example might be product costs. You might be able to import based on a product ID the cost. So if you didn't get the cost through DB Vista, another way is you could basically import the cost after the fact as a new currency event. You might use data sources to do product returns. So you have 50 orders on a day. You want to know how many of those orders were actually returned. Well, that's something that obviously doesn't happen on the website if they go to a store. So you might take your data from the store and then import that to data sources so you can see product returns. You might use it to look at a workflow that happens after the website. So for example, in the past, I worked and managed the analytics at salesforce.com. So you might say we have websites metrics like how many people viewed a form, how many people completed a form, so they became a lead. But then maybe in the next couple of weeks, we find out if we actually got them as a customer. That there's no way we would know that on the website, but we could import how many deals actually took place. Or you might want to import some third-party marketing data. And for those of you who used to know the term Genesis, I believe it's now called data connectors. There's thousands of third-party marketing products that integrate with Adobe Analytics, like email tools and so on. And many of these have their own metrics that kind of make sense to see with some online metrics that could be imported through data sources. So that's kind of the why you would use it, is you want to merge different metrics. Now, how it actually works is that you import the data via FTP or API, And the imports basically normally are, I've normally done them through FTP, and they use a template that you create. And that template is kind of similar to what you would do with Saint. You just have to kind of fill out the template and then FTP it. Now, imports are primarily set up for metrics, but they can include EVARs. And I'll kind of show this in a little bit, but EVAR values will be bound only to the metrics that they're actually uploaded with, which is really important for you to understand. Data sources, to my knowledge, does not work with SPROPs. So it's really just events and EVARs. And when you import your data, if everything is tied to a date, if you're importing data for the current date, it basically takes about 2 hours. If you're importing data for several dates, Adobe claims that the longest it will take for all of the data to come in is 17 hours. So how do you actually configure and use data sources? So I'll kind of walk you through the steps, but again, there's a user guide that you can see for this as well. But basically, you go into the admin area, and you have to be an administrator to do this. You would click on data sources, and there you'd be taken to a wizard that basically kind of asks you some questions and asks you to make some choices. Now, there's lots of different templates that Adobe has created. To be honest with you, I never use the templates. I just find that it actually takes more time than just doing it manually. So I generally tend to use the generic template. And once you choose that, then there's a couple different options that you have here. There's summary data, full processing, and transaction ID. I generally use summary data. I'll be talking about transaction ID in a minute, but basically full processing is one that I don't recommend because Adobe even doesn't recommend it. They recommend using the bulk data insertion API instead, and that's a whole different topic for another day. So once you choose your topic, the template, which again I use generic, you give it a name, you give it an email address, and then you just have to approve that there might be some cost associated with this. And my understanding is that this varies based on different packages, but I believe that every row of data that you import will count as one server call, which sounds like a lot, but actually isn't that big of a deal because you're generally not importing millions and millions of rows through data sources. But I would always encourage you to talk to client care. I can't keep track of what Adobe does and does not charge for these days. So just find out the costs associated with it. Now, once you've approved that, then you basically choose what are the metrics that you want to import in. Now, I would have you enter the names that you want them to show up. And my best practice is I always set up the success events ahead of time because I want to make sure I'm choosing the correct success events. Because if you import data into the wrong success event, you will be in a whole world of trouble. So I would set up the success events and EVARs that you want to use before you enter this wizard. And then as you type in this case, I typed in one of the screens, advertising impressions and advertising clicks, and then I just click to map it to the events 5 and 6 that I want to use for that. Now, if you want, there is a checkbox there that I've never used where it'll actually rename the events in the admin console to whatever you put in this description. I don't think that's a good idea. And one thing I will highlight is that in this wizard, you can only add 3 metrics. And the same thing works for EVARs. It makes you think that you can only use 3 metrics when you import, but the truth is that this is just a limitation of the wizard. Once you have the template, you can add as many metrics as you want. You're not limited just to the 3 that you do in the wizard. So after you've picked your events, the next thing is optionally to choose whether you want to have any EVARs associated with the events that you're going to be uploading. In this case, just to show you it's possible, I chose tracking code. Now, once you're done with that, you're going to get to a screen that looks like this, which is going to give you the button to download your template and then have your username and password for the FTP upload. And this should look pretty familiar for those of you who have ever done a Saint upload. So pretty similar process. Now, when you get the template, as I mentioned, you can add anything that you want to the template, and it has kind of a standard format that you get to learn here. There's a couple rows, and the bottom row is kind of the EVAR number or the event number. I have found that the way that Adobe does it, there is kind of a strict structure there. So you want to definitely test this out in dev and make sure that you're putting in the right things. I don't think the order of the columns matters, but for some reason they always put the date, then the EVARs, then the events. So I just stick with that. But in this case, if you wanted to add 10 more events, you could just add them by just putting event 7, event 8, and just give it a name at the top. I don't actually think the first two rows even do anything. And then underneath it, that's when you would populate your data. It is important that all of your data have a date. Now, once you're done, what's really cool about data sources is that your users will really not, in many cases, not know the difference between what was done in data sources and what was done in JavaScript. Here, I'm showing an example where I have an email ID EVAR, a responses message ID. And that message ID makes sense with the stuff that happens at the far right that was populated in JavaScript, the stuff that happened online, maybe my cart additions, my orders, my revenue. I can easily break that down by the email that drove them. But what I didn't know is how many emails were sent, delivered, open. So what you see here is that by uploading these 6 or 7 metrics from responses and associating them with an EVAR value of EVAR 65, the responses ID, assuming that I didn't make any mistakes with the EVAR value, I didn't have an extra space or anything wrong, then Adobe will line up all of that data in one report if I wanted to. And what's really cool about this is that if you wanted to, you can now make a calculated metric that says, I want to look at orders per email sent, which is something that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't have data sources. Now, obviously, there's a lot of work involved with data sources. And if it's too much work for you, the other alternative is always just to take the data from, in this case, responses and push it down to Microsoft Excel. And then you can use the Excel tool that comes with Adobe Analytics to just pull down your Adobe Analytics metrics. And you could always do a formula in Microsoft Excel. But the nice part about data sources is everything is in Adobe Analytics. So you could put it on your analysis workspace dashboards and make it available with all the other information. And this is just one example using email just to show that your users really wouldn't be able to distinguish which was kind of JavaScript and which was data sources. Here's another example of a case where I've used data sources in the past where I had a client that had an order ID EVAR. And then what they did is they wanted to see their online orders and online revenue compared to what their backend system thought. And you can see here, I've highlighted in red a lot of cases where maybe the data was different. If you look at the top, you could see that there's cases where online someone messed up and we actually have 2 orders and the dollar amounts aren't matching. There's in row 3, we've got $101 online, but the backend says we only had 51. In row 6, we see that for some reason, the backend thought that order was $325, but online it was 310. And then the one that's most interesting is row 10. If we didn't do the data sources upload, we would never know that we were actually missing an order online. And you notice that there's a 0 in the online order and revenue, but we noticed there was one backend order for $500. And we might be living in a fantasy world thinking we have all of the orders covered. But in this case, we don't. And that might actually be one of the ones that is in the none row at the top and so on. So sometimes it's data sources can be useful to kind of take some backend information and insanity check some of your online metrics. But as with everything in Adobe Analytics, there's always some gotchas. So I wanted to share some of the gotchas that you have to watch out for when you're using any feature, especially data sources. Once you've imported data through data sources, it cannot be removed. Now, there is a crazy amount of money you can pay for Adobe to remove it, but I wouldn't recommend that. So you want to make sure that you're really careful when you're importing data sources. The biggest problem I've seen is people think that a data source upload didn't work, and then they didn't wait long enough, and then they upload it again, and then all of their data is doubled. Every row has to have a certain format. And again, you can follow this in the documentation area of Adobe. If it doesn't have a date, it's going to fail. When you're using the FTP upload, you can't upload more than 50 megabytes of data at a time, or it's going to crap out on you. The FTP uploads have to be followed with a .fin file, just like with sync classification uploads. You can only upload data for 90 dates at a time. So you can't upload like a whole year's worth of data for all of last year. So keep in mind that you've got to focus on 90 days at a time. And unfortunately, and there's been many suggestions that myself and others have made to change this, but you cannot upload future data. So I've always wanted to use data sources to upload into a success event targets, goals that I have for metrics, which would be really cool. But Adobe, to my knowledge, still will not let you upload for a future date. You have to do it only for dates today and in the past. The metrics that you upload will only be tied to the EVARs that are uploaded with them, which means that any metrics that you upload will show up as unspecified for any other EVARs that aren't uploaded with them. And that makes sense because Adobe just doesn't understand when it gets a metric like how to retroactively figure out what EVAR values to go with that. And you can import negative numbers into metrics, which sometimes people use to kind of fix mistakes that they make. Over the years, and I've been doing this a long time, Adobe's kind of gone back and forth on whether they recommend or don't recommend uploading negative numbers. I personally have been burned by it a couple times in the past, so I generally stay away from it, and I'd prefer to upload a positive number into a data source metric and then just use a calculated metric to subtract it out. So just some tips, things to know before you kind of go crazy with data sources. And one other tip I'll give you that isn't really an Adobe tip, but just something that I've done in the past that I find to be helpful is I generally try to upload a unique value with every data source upload. And I just make like an EVAR and just call it data sources. In this case, I'm just made a fake example where I put in the date of November 2nd to 20 or something like that. And basically, if you upload that with every row, what's nice is that if you do make a mistake, you can use the powerful segmentation capabilities of Adobe Analytics to be able to take that data out if you ever need to. So last thing I want to cover is transaction ID. So transaction ID is a more advanced version of data sources. And it acts just like data sources, but what's unique about it is it lets you connect the uploaded metrics to all EVARs that were present at the time that a unique transaction ID was set. And this one really does tend to confuse people a little bit, but I want to go through an example. If a visitor comes to the website and they have an online session, a unique transaction ID would be set into the s.transaction ID in JavaScript. And it doesn't have to be an order ID. It could be any ID. It could be their user ID. It could be just any random ID. When that is set into s.transaction ID, what Adobe does is it takes a snapshot of all of the EVARs that currently have values, except for products, which is technically not considered to be an EVAR, and it stores it in a data table. And that's stored typically for 90 days by default. Then when you upload metrics in the future using data sources, if you upload it with that matching transaction ID, then Adobe will associate those metrics with all of the EVAR values that were present when the snapshot was taken. So this is a way that you can bridge the gap between the values that you have in your EVARs and offline metrics, which is really powerful. So this is useful whenever you want to connect post, online, or website metrics to things that happened in the past. So some examples might be, I want to upload product returns as a metric in data sources, but I want to tie those product returns to my EVARs that happened in the past. For example, which campaign code did they come from when they did the original order, so that I'm taking the return out of that same campaign. Maybe I want to connect offline phone orders to the online session. What's really crazy is if someone searched for the word book and that went into an EVAR and then they went offline and did an order on the phone, if you uploaded that order, you could actually tie it to the search term of book because transaction ID would allow you to do that. You can connect online leads to post website sales. So maybe someone fills out a form and later revenue comes in. You can actually look at all of the stuff they did on the website. What was their entry page? What was the search term they used? What was the tool that they used on the website? And tie that to downstream qualified leads, new customers, and revenue. And in one crazy case, I even did this for a customer where they wanted to look at what was the campaign that led to someone coming to the website to fill out a job application, and then see if they actually got hired, and even tie it to maybe their performance review a year later. So anytime you want to connect the online to offline, you can use transaction ID. Now, this is turned on either in the admin console or through client care. And at the end of the day, when you're uploading the metrics, it really looks just like a data sources upload. It just happens to have an extra column for transaction ID where you put the unique ID in. Now, one cool use of transaction ID was that I use is when I worked at Salesforce.com. So we had a tracking code report, and we wanted to see form completions, and that happened on the website. But then later, we would use transaction ID to upload which accounts became opened, how much revenue we got for recurring revenue. And that allowed us to make a calculated metric that would look at recurring revenue per form completion, which is an offline metric divided by an online metric, and see it all for tracking code, which was something that was captured online. Now, obviously, our Salesforce backend system had no idea which tracking code the revenue was associated with, but Adobe took care of all that through transaction ID. And here's an example if you're doing a product return. So in this case, someone might have ordered an iPod online, but now they want to upload that $50 is being returned. And since the product isn't associated as an EVAR, in this case, we're associating the product with it, but we're using the transaction ID. So maybe they bought 2 iPods for $50, but they returned one of them. And in this case, now, anytime that someone used the net revenue calculated metric, it would work in all EVAR reports. And since we have the product here, it would work in the product report as well. So the last couple of gotchas here with transaction ID. You can use multiple rows for the same transaction ID. So you can have lots of different things that you're uploading all to the same transaction ID. As I mentioned, since products is not part of the EVAR snapshot, you want to make sure that you include that, and you want to have one row per product. So if you're uploading returns, if they bought multiple products, then you want to have the same transaction ID maybe in 3 rows, but have one row for each product 3 times. By default, the snapshot is 90 days, but you can call client care and extend that. I don't know if they're charging for that these days. The transaction ID has to be under 100 characters. And if the same snapshot if the same transaction ID is used multiple times, then it only uses the initial snapshot. So just be cognizant of that. You want to make sure that you know that that's happening. The other thing is, this is the trickiest part, is that the expiration window for EVARs is tied to the snapshot, not the date that you upload the metrics, which can be really confusing. So for example, if an EVAR expires at the visit and is set in that visit, and then the transaction ID is set in that visit while the EVAR is still present and it hasn't expired, even if you upload the metric and tie it to a date that's like a week later, it will still be associated with that EVAR because it's using the expiration of the data snapshot. So even though it's a week later and it wouldn't make sense, it's kind of going back in time and saying, well, at the time of the transaction ID, the EVAR was valid. So I'm going to associate it with that EVAR value. So again, some of the stuff can get a little confusing. And then the last thing I'll say is, while all of this sounds really cool, things like Vista and data sources and being able to tie online and offline, Adobe is moving into a new world with their Adobe Experience Platform and Customer Journey Analytics, which is a new way that you can import data into Adobe. And I know many of you probably aren't using AEP or CJA yet, but when you do start using that, a lot of the things we're talking about here, Vista, DB Vista, and data sources and transaction ID, are probably going to be less relevant because AEP and the platform and customer journey analytics have a different, and in some cases a better way to use timestamps to actually see the full journey. So think of data sources and transaction ID and DB Vista as almost like a bridge that's been gone for the last couple of years. but some of that will probably be replaced. So if you're thinking of moving to platform, you may want to think about not going too crazy with data sources, DB VISTA, and transaction ID, because it'll probably become moot once you move to the new and improved Adobe Experience Platform. So that's everything I wanted to talk about for Vista, and we'll use the remaining time that we have to go through some questions, which I haven't had a chance to really check out yet, so I'll do my best here. So can you use transaction ID with something other than transaction ID as the primary key? Yeah, it could be any alphanumeric value, so it doesn't really matter what you use. Next one. I have configured sheet with events between evars and it works. So there's no concrete rule, events and evars. Okay, cool. Yeah, so you can do, it doesn't, the order doesn't seem to matter. Can wrongly uploaded data be adjusted? Yeah, I mentioned that. Again, you can use negative values. I would just make sure you test it out. There's other ways that you can fix data. I'm a big fan of kind of fixing stuff through segmentation as well. Is there any way to upload data in QA first instead of production to check the output? For sure, yeah. So you should have a staging and a development report suite. So I would always recommend testing your data in a report suite, especially if you're doing data sources. Now, it will cost you a little extra money if you upload a lot of rows to your development, then staging, then production, but it may be worth it. So maybe you just do it once, just to a dev or staging. And keep in mind that you might have to wait 17 hours for that data to come in. So just make sure that you give it enough time to make sure if it worked or didn't work before you import it again. Someone mentioned, instead of DB Vista, can we not just add the segment or lifetime value with a server call and put it in a data layer? So you definitely can do that, but the question is, do you know that at the time, and at the time that the data is happening? Because you want to make sure that you get that in so that it's associated with all of your evars, and that may be a larger topic that we could take offline. But in general, there's lots of ways to get around using DB Vista, but DB Vista is kind of an easier way to do it. It just, you're kind of paying for the convenience. Would a Vista rule work for tracking a visitor's activity from one report suite to another? So a Vista rule is not going to, by definition, just automatically kind of fix some of the inherent issues of having data in different report suites. It would solve that problem if you were actually duplicating data from report suite A to report suite B. So maybe you have, like, for example, 10 country sites, and you're sending data just into each country site. You could double tag that and do multi-suite tagging, and also send it to the global suite just just through the tagging. I don't know why you would want to do this, but instead of doing it through the tagging, if you wanted to, you could use a Vista rule to send the data to a global report suite, which then would allow you to see visitors' activity from one report suite or one website to the other, but you'd be paying money to do something you could do in JavaScript. I would probably only use a Vista rule in that case if for some reason you wanted to not do it all the time on every hit, but in certain situations, maybe if they're a customer. I did have one company that said, we want to take all of our traffic and put it into one report suite. And then if the customer logs in, they were a bank, then they wanted to then use a Vista rule to send the data to a second report suite, which they called the customer report suite. And that might be a case where you would do it. Another question, does Adobe deduplicate orders and events that are submitted with a transaction ID? So Adobe deduplicates orders through the purchase ID and events through serialization. So there's nothing, transaction ID is not going to help you with any type of deduplication. Can I assign a customer ID to the transaction ID once customer logs in and then later connect that? Yes, you certainly can. Just keep in mind that when you pass the data to the customer ID, it is my understanding that it's going to use the first snapshot. We'd have to check with Adobe. I don't know if that snapshot, stops at the end of the session and then starts over. I don't know if when they say that it's only the first snapshot, if it's within a session. If it wasn't, that would be problematic, because then you'd only be getting the data from the initial snapshots. So Ashish, that would be something I would check with Adobe on, but I have seen people use the customer ID as a way to do that. If we upload conversion metrics in like the Salesforce example, which did happen several weeks later, does the conversion go back to the visit or come in as a new visit? So it's my understanding that it would be tied to the initial session. I don't know if it would be if when you upload it, that will charge as a new visit. I'd have to test that out. I generally am not too worried about the visit metric myself. So Melissa, that'd be something that I would definitely just kind of test out. Cool. So that was a lot of information all at one time, but I hope that gives you kind of a primer on Vista and data sources as an alternative way to inject data in. If you have additional questions, I'm showing my email address. You're more than welcome to send me an email here, and I'll see if I can answer those questions. But thank you once again for joining the session. I hope you found it educational and helpful, and this will be posted in the Slack group later today. So thanks so much and have a wonderful day, everyone.